So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me here to the Zeppelin University. And I'm delighted to present one of my papers here, which has a very long title, namely The Impact of Two Different Economic Systems on Dishonesty and Charitable Giving, Determinants of Group-Level Variation. So you don't have to remember the title, but the most important thing is it's about dishonesty and charitable giving among East and West Germans, and we would refer to them as people living in socialist or formerly socialist regions and formerly more capitalist regions. The paper is joint work with Dan, Heather, Jimena, and Katrin, and it was mostly motivated by the fact that I was once listening to a presentation by Dan in San Francisco where he presented work on dishonesty, and then he suggested that actually people around the world are cheating everywhere the same, and there's not much difference in their cheating behavior. And then people were raising their hand and saying, well, but in my country it's different. And everyone suggested, you know, it's maybe in Spain or let's say in Israel or in Germany. And Dan said, no, that's not the case. And we ran a study and we found that actually cheating is pretty similar actually across different countries. And so we said, or at least I had the idea, and I said like, what about Germany, and in particular East Germany? Maybe they are different, and maybe there's variation within one particular country and not between countries. So, and I got further intrigued by the research on dishonesty by reading an article by Nina Czech and Armin Falk, where they could actually show with a very clever experiment that market economies or competition will decay morals. And they could show that if people are in a market setting, they would be more willing to sacrifice the life of a mouse. And then further, Cohen and co-authors, they could actually show that in the banking industry, so again, like more capitalist institution, you would say that there people are more willing to cheat if they feel they are on a banking setting. And I felt this is actually what Harold Dempsey called a nirvana fallacy, because all of these papers were comparing real institutional settings with an idealized setting, saying like, for instance, you compare a competition setting with no competition, but there's never no competition. And I felt it would make more sense to compare a real economic system with another economic system. And being born and raised in East Germany, the most natural thing for me to compare was the socialist system of former East Germany. So furthermore, I believe that listening to Jonathan Haidt's book in the car sometimes on morality, that morality actually differed much more within one country as compared to between countries. And I felt like this could also be something that takes place with dishonesty in one particular country. Maybe we don't find differences between countries, but within one country, maybe next street people will be completely different. Think about New York, the Bronx, or Manhattan. People might differ in their dishonesty. And I felt the natural thing would be to do actually to compare dishonesty among socialist or formerly socialist regions and former capitalist regions. Okay, so what we did is we came up with 4 hypotheses, and we said like, well, actually people should differ in their dishonesty and potentially also pro-social behavior if they're on one of the 2 systems. And we would say maybe it's even socialism that decays morals, because in a socialist system most often you actually had to cheat actually to get some economic goods that weren't available for you, and actually it might have made sense to cheat in front of the secret police because there was no other way you could do it. And so you adopted to this over time and you did it over and over again. You might not have felt bad about it because it was the only thing you could do at the time, but you learned how to do this kind of behavior. And in a second step, and I can tell you in our first study we actually found out that people differed in their behavior and they actually differed in their cheating behavior. And then we said like we have to run a second study to find more out about the channel, how that works. And so we thought an interesting channel to look at is what is if people after reunification saw the other system. And Dan had this idea and he said like maybe it's upward social comparison. They actually see how the other system works, then they felt betrayed, and then they said, well, now I'm also eligible to cheat, which I wasn't before maybe. Okay. And we also would argue that it actually matters how long you were exposed to the system. Let's say if you lived your entire youth in a socialist system, on a capitalist system, this should have a larger impact upon you as if you were born just a couple of years before the reunification. You didn't really learn a lot about socialism. You never joined the pioneer troops or whatever, and you don't know how the system worked, for instance. And finally, we would have said that also pro-social giving behavior might differ, and there's a lot of evidence in the literature on that already. But we would say people under a socialist system, actually, they have kind of learned potentially how redistribution works. And this might have been to the good or to the worse, because redistribution might have not worked that well under socialism. On the other hand, they might have more experience in redistribution and might be more willing to also give for a charitable cause. So the first thing we did was we thought about where do we get a sample from? Like how should we actually approach people to run an experiment on this topic? And the first papers we knew were by Ockenfels and Weimann, and what they did was they ran an experiment in a lab in Magdeburg and Bochum, and they did this with students. And we thought there are two things about this. First of all, being born and raised in East Germany, I thought, well, people from Magdeburg, my aunt from Magdeburg might be very much different from my uncle somewhere in Berlin, let's say, or from Rostock. And I felt like even within one particular region, saying if you're from Bavaria, like my parents-in-law, and let's say from another region in West Germany, they would differ a lot. And so it would be ideal actually to have a setting where you have East and West Germans from the same region, and in the same region, they have been exposed to socialism and to capitalism. And the second thing was our own studies showed actually that if you run a cheating study on students, you could actually see that the students were cheating more than the general public. And this could have been for several reasons. For instance, because they just needed the money, and for that reason they cheated more. And then you could say, well, people from Bochum or from Magdeburg, the students just had different needs or different financial needs. They just needed the money more than in the other regions, but that doesn't have anything to do with differences in the regions. It's just the students needed more money in one of the two regions. So the first solution we came across to solve this problem was we thought that in Germany, actually, everyone has to pick up their ID. And actually, I'm not sure you're aware of that, but if you don't have an ID, you should get one, because there's also a fine if you cannot show your ID. Then you will actually have to pay, I think, around 3,000 or 5,000 euros. This would be the maximum fine, so you should have your ID. And most of the people, they get their ID regularly over a course of 10 years. They have to pick it up in one of the citizen centers. And we thought if we do our study in the citizen centers, we get a more or less representative study of the people collecting their IDs there. Okay, so this is what we did. We went to many different citizen centers. This is one of them. And we met a lot of different people, which was very interesting. Some of the people we weren't aware whether they would actually speak German or not. We approached all of them. And sometimes we got very surprised who we met. We had people who fell asleep during the study. I remember one punk just fell asleep during running the study. And so we met a lot of good people. And so this was the first fix we had to the problem we recognized before. And the second was we wanted to have one city where all the people from a socialist region and from a former capitalist or currently capitalist region were actually in the same place. And it was not their regional culture. And the natural thing that came to our mind was the following city, which you're probably aware of, which is Berlin. And I'm not sure you can see it, but usually if you look at this picture, and I'm not sure the beamer allows you to see it, but it shows you Berlin at night, and you can actually see that on the left-hand side, the light bulbs are much lighter. And on the right side, they are a bit more yellow. And actually, this shows you kind of why this experiment was so nice or so interesting to us, because it shows if you're nowadays in Berlin, you wouldn't even see the difference. You could actually cross the border or the former Berlin Wall, but you wouldn't know where it actually is. Sometimes actually the city puts signs on that and you can now see it. But the picture is kind of evidence that the difference between East and West Germany is still there. And it's maybe also in the heads of the people living there. And they could actually see whether they're on the one part or on the other, because just the light bulbs are different. And there still are 28 years later, which is very interesting, I think. Okay, so what did we do? So we ran two studies. The first one we ran in Berlin. We did this in various different regions of the city, in 6 administrative regions and 9 different citizen centers. And we did the same study again in Leipzig and in Dortmund. And this is actually the variation we want to use. And here you can see it again. So in one of the two regions, people are pretty distant from each other, namely Leipzig and Dortmund. And in Berlin, it was again divided into an eastern part and a western part. And their people are pretty close to each other. So they could actually see how the other system worked, and they can see it every day if they go with the subway to their jobs on the other side of the city, for instance. But the important thing is, like, these are all Prussians. So if you're from Bavaria, you're well aware that these are all Prussian people over here. And so they should have the same kind of heritage. And they have the same opportunities in terms of jobs. You couldn't recognize if somebody talks to you because of their accent that they're East or West Germans. They are just pretty similar, more similar than people from Leipzig and Dortmund, for instance. Okay, so we needed to find out how people are cheating. And the first difference we use is the difference between East and West Germany before the erection of the Berlin Wall. And we would say, well, this is the variation we want to use. And obviously, people moved from the east to the west, but these were very tiny numbers. Like, people moving from the west to the east overall were very few. And on the other hand, people moving from the east to the west were a bit more, and we could check for this in our study. And we found, I think there was one person actually who moved from the east to the west before the wall came down. But there's no real problem of sample selection in terms of that people actually moved from the one side to the other, and they have been self-selective. Okay, so how did we find out whether people were cheating or not? So what we did was we used a test that was also used before by, or developed before by Jiang. And what she did was she gave people a die and let them roll the die. And we actually let the people roll the die 40 times in a row. And we said before they throw the die, they have to decide on one side of the die. That is either the top side of the die or the bottom side of the die. They just had to make up their mind. What do you want, top or bottom? So then they rolled the die, and after rolling the die, they had to report the number of dots on the die on the respective side they had chosen. So let's imagine you rolled it, made up your mind, you rolled the die, you choose top in the first place, and you see on top there's only 1. And then you might have said, was I really sure? Maybe it wasn't top, maybe it was bottom. And then you said, I think it was bottom actually I chose before. And then you said, it was a 6 on the other side. And they could choose every time they rolled the die. Every time they had to make a new decision. They did this 40 times in a row. And for one of their rolls, we picked at random after they did their 40 times rollings. We said, for one of the rolls you do, we choose one and you get €1 for each dot on this particular roll. So if for this one roll out of the 40, you had a roll of 5, let's say, we would give you €5. And they knew this before, so they knew all of this before. And so what we did was, we ran the study, and afterwards we also run a short survey to find out where they actually came from. We did this afterwards because we didn't want to prime them to be East German or West German or anything, so they should first do the task and then run the survey. And for the survey, we found a lot of things out about them, for instance, where they came from, whether they moved from the one side or to the other. And we thought, what would be a good measure for their heritage, where they actually came from? And a lot of people said they're neither East German nor West German, so we couldn't really identify that, like saying people most of the time would say they are German. And so, but we needed to know what their heritage is. So we said, like, what is your family background? Where is your family coming back? Is the family coming from the East or from the West? And then people actually differentiated, and they said, like, yeah, my family is from the East, or my family is from the West, and then they would actually say where they came from. And this we used to differentiate. So here are some summary statistics, and what they actually show you is, for instance, that the average roll was a 3.7. So in theory, it should be 3.5. Because then it would be a fair die, and people would report the top side and the bottom side with the same probability, and you should actually get a 3.5 out of this. So what you see is people cheating a little bit. And this is consistent with what Dan calls self-concept maintenance, namely that you're not cheating all the way, even though there's no real chance that you will get detected, because it could be you're very lucky and you're cheating a lot, but I cannot detect it, maybe you're just lucky. But it's against Gary Becker's theory of crime and punishment, where you would say if detection probability is 0, you would actually cheat all the way. And this is not what we're observing, so apparently people try to maintain their self-concept and are able to wake up the next morning and say, actually, I'm a good and upright individual, and I can still look in the mirror, and I didn't kill my grandmother. Okay, so what you also see is that people are on average 37 years old. We had one child which was 12 years old who did the study with her mother together, and we had one older lady which was 87, and there was really everything in there. So half of the population was female, the other half was male. We asked for their education, standard of living, and we actually asked for the standard of living in abstract terms, and we didn't want to know their real income because the real income might be perceived very different for East Germans and West Germans. East Germans might say, well, 2,000 euros in Berlin, this is great, I can happily live with that in Berlin. And West Germans might say, well, 2,000 euros is quite a few money because, or little money, because how can I afford the champagne in KaDeWe, so I cannot live very well with this money. And so we use an abstract measure in terms of, compared to others, how well are you actually off. Then we asked them about their political leaning in terms of East and West on a scale from 1 to 10. And we asked all of them whether they would trust East Germans and how much they would trust West Germans. And finally, we said we also have to control for the following, namely whether they perceived that the West cheated the East after the reunification. And why do we think about that? Because, well, you could argue that after the reunification, well, a lot of people actually came to East Germany. They thought, well, they don't have any good cars. I have an old car, I want to buy a new car, so let's sell my old car to the East Germans. They are happy with that. I get a new car, so that's Pareto efficiency, everyone is happy. And, but at some time people realized in the East, well, we got all the old cars. We bought all of these old insurance contracts which are not worth it, and they might have felt bad about it. And because they felt bad about it, they could have said, well, now it's my right to cheat because I got always betrayed by the West, so it's okay if I'm cheating. Okay, so we wanted to control for that. And as you can say, well, actually 30% of the people said this was the case. 70% didn't say that was the case. So here are the first results. So what you see here is, again, differentiated by East German family background and West German family background. The frequency or the percentage, how often people rolled a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, and a 6. And you see, well, actually 16.6%, or let's say 1/6, there should be a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on for fair die. But what you can see is that people reported a 1, 2, and 3 less frequent than probability would suggest. And you see the 4, 5, and 6 is more frequently rolled. So this is in line with the descriptive statistics, so people were cheating a little bit, not all the way. And you can see actually when it made sense economically the most, namely when you roll the 1, you're more likely to report a 6. Or you're actually most likely to report a 6. Now you could say, well, how do you know that people just didn't make up any rolls? I mean, let's imagine they are even more mean, and what they did was they rolled a 2, and then they said, well, it was actually 6. So you rolled a 2, you say it's a 6. They didn't say, I chose the other side of the die, it was not the 2, it was the 5, I just make up my mind new, but they cheat outrageously. But we can know that actually, whether they did it, because the probability of rolling a 1 and a 6 should be 33%. And then you make up your mind and you say, either I have top or bottom, but the combined probability of 1 and 6 should still be 33%, no matter whether you choose top or bottom. But let's imagine you roll a 2 and then you report a 6. So that would mean 2 and 5 have a lower probability than 33%, and 1 and 6 combined should have a higher probability than 33%. And we checked that, and we actually see, well, this is pretty equal. So whether you have 1 and 6, 2 and 5, 3 and 4, the percentage of these rolls combined are pretty similar. So that's, people are not cheating outrageously, just making up a roll. They actually chose differently in terms of when they made up their mind for the top side, they reported actually the bottom side when it makes sense. Okay, so what did we find? So the first thing was we looked for the region. So we ran the study in Berlin, Leipzig, and Dortmund. And in Berlin, we checked whether these are people from the East or from the West. And what you can see is that for people where we run the study in East Berlin, is that we actually found that cheating was 60%, so they reported the higher side of the die with a 60% probability. So actually that's not the cheating. Actually, if you report a 50% chance of reporting the higher side, this would be actually a fair die. So we report a 4, 5, and 6 with a 50% likelihood. And but what you can see is that in Berlin, East Germans reported these better sides of the die with a 60% probability. And for West Berlin, actually you see it's only 55. But this is actually quite a lot in terms of difference because it's twice as much. Because here you're deviating 5% from 50%, and here you're deviating 10%. So the difference is actually quite high. And this is also statistically significant at the 5% level. For people from Leipzig, they were cheating a little bit more, but not significantly so. And from Dortmund, they were quite similar to people from West Berlin, for instance. So there was no difference except if you were in Berlin and you were reporting to be East German. Okay, now you could say, what about the people from Berlin? So are they actually people from Berlin, or where do they come from? And what we found in our study is that the people in Berlin we run the study on were to 1/4 each of them either from, were either from East Berlin, West Berlin, East Germany, or West Germany. So this is only for people who came or where we run the study in Berlin. And so we had 1/4 for each of them. And what you can see is that the people from East Berlin actually cheated the most. People in Berlin who came from East Germany also cheated a little bit more. And if you were in Berlin and the West Berliner or a West Germaner, you actually cheated quite as much as before. Okay, so now this is only comparing the two groups, but not controlling for other factors. So it could be because of their political leaning, they moved to Berlin and so on, and this was actually the reason why they differed in their cheating behavior. But what we find is that if we control for people being East German per se didn't have a significant effect on which side of the die you are actually reporting, so the better side or the lower side. If you're located in Berlin or if you run the study in Berlin, also this didn't have an effect. So in terms of, it's not a Berlin per se effect. But if you combine running the study in Berlin and being East German, so if these two come together, you actually see a quite strong and significant effect. And for this coefficient, you actually see that the likelihood that you're reporting the better side of the die, or the high rolling side of the die, namely 4, 5, and 6, is 18.5% higher for this group, East Germans located in Berlin, as compared to all the other groups. So we said, well, maybe we are not really capturing the East Germans here. So we thought we need a new definition potentially for East Germans. And what we did was, we wanted to identify what is a real East German. And we said, like, a real East German must fulfill several criteria. We said, he must have been born in East Germany, he must still live in East Germany, and he must have said, my family background is East German. So if these three things come together, we generated a new sample, and actually we found then the effect becomes much stronger. So then actually the difference is 22.1% if we only consider these real East Germans as compared to real West Germans. Okay, then one of our hypotheses stated, actually it makes a difference how long you were exposed to socialism. And what we said is, like, we need to take different cohorts. So we said, were you at least born before the reunification? Were you 10 years old at the time of the reunification? Or were you at least 20 years old at the time of the reunification? And what you see is that the effect always becomes stronger as compared to all the other groups, the longer people had exposure to socialism or capitalism. So actually, the length of your exposure actually matters. We also found some of our control variables to be significant, which is the age. The older you get, the more likely you are to cheat. The effect is very small, I can reassure you. Education played a role. The more educated you are, the less likely you are to cheat. And actually our variable on West Germans cheated the East was also significant, but not in the way we expected. Actually it was negative, meaning that if people said the West Germans cheated the East, then they were less likely to cheat themselves in the task beforehand. And we checked this result more intensely, and what we found was it was mostly West Germans who actually claimed that the West Germans cheated the East Germans, and not the East Germans. Okay, so that was interesting. So then we said, maybe there's a different story behind this. Maybe the East Germans in Berlin, they are just much more clever in terms of learning the task. You know, they realized how to cheat, they realized it's not going to happen, that they get punished, and over time running the task, they know how to do it. So we checked the likelihood again of reporting the better side of the die, and over the 40 rolls, and what you see is that over time, once they rolled the die, the probability didn't increase. So the likelihood of reporting the better or higher rolling side of the die was as high for the first roll as it was for the last roll. And so apparently there was no learning going on for either of the two groups. So for both of them, cheating happened during the first rolls as it did for the last rolls. Okay, so the next thing we did was we wanted to find out whether cheaters actually were more willing to donate later on. And we know that a bit because there's this literature on moral cleansing which shows that if you do something immoral and then you wash your hand, you feel actually better about it. And we said, like, you know, if you cheat a little, maybe if you can donate something, then you feel better. So if you're a high cheater, you're more likely actually to donate money afterwards. And what we did was we gave them a chance. They didn't have an option. They either could donate to an East German hospital or to West German hospital, but they were randomly assigned to that. So either they had the group for East German hospital or West German hospital. And what we found out was that it didn't matter whether they had to donate to East or West German hospital. It didn't matter for people. Also, it didn't matter where they came from, like their background didn't matter, so it wasn't a matter of being East or West German, whether they donated more or less. Okay. But then we thought, what about our hypothesis on cheaters? And we collapsed our data in two groups. So we said people who are in the upper two quartiles of the cheaters, or potential cheaters, we don't know whether they cheated. So if they're in the upper two quartiles, we would say these are the high cheaters. And if they're in the lowest quartile, we would say these are the low cheaters. And collapsing our data like this, what we found was the high cheaters actually donated less. They donated 75% of their earnings, and the low cheaters donated 74% of the money. So now you might say, well, actually there's a problem here because the people who are high cheaters, they also earned more money. But that's not the case, because the interesting thing is we let them roll the die 40 times, we picked one of their rolls, and out of this they got the payment. And since they only cheated a little, it meant that they get almost randomly assigned a payout. And we checked for that, and actually they received very much the same payout. So we checked for the particular roles, and what you can see is that here you have a roll of 1, or a payout of 1, a payout of 2, 3, 4, and so on. The blue columns show you the high cheaters, and the gray columns show you the low cheaters. And what you see is that for each payout, or for each earning, the low cheaters always donate a higher percentage of the earnings as compared to the high cheaters. So we found this very interesting because it shows that apparently there's no moral cleansing going on. It's more that you have a certain personality trait in terms of if you're more willing to cheat, you're also less likely to donate something later on. Okay, so what did we find out? So we think, or we want to be very modest about our results actually. So what we want to say is, first of all, we think there's a difference between the two systems, and it had an impact on people's morality. However, we cannot say that there is a general impact of socialism on morals. So there must be a channel through that. And even though there might be other explanations, but we would say what becomes obvious is that if the system is more salient, as it is in Berlin, the other system, then we found that people are cheating more. However, there could be other stories about this, and I think we should investigate more research to find out how this actually comes about. But we think there is a difference for people who are in Berlin and can see each other, even though they are not only Berliners, they are also East Germans being in Berlin, they're also West Germans being in Berlin, and they still differ in their cheating behavior. Okay, what we didn't find was that there was a difference in the pro-social giving behavior of the two groups, which is interesting because apparently antisocial behavior, there is a difference for the two groups, but pro-social behavior didn't differ for the two groups we investigated here. But interestingly, so what we found is that people who were cheated more actually were less willing to donate in general. And this didn't have anything to do with being an East German or a West German. And I thank you very much for your attention. Yeah. Yeah. We didn't test for that because it wasn't our prior hypothesis. But when we saw the results exposed, actually, this would be a very good justification for what we found, yeah. And I think it's very plausible, actually, yeah. Potentially. So as I said, we didn't control for personality traits, which we should have done probably now seeing the results. Yeah, I also think that it could have to do something with seeing the opportunity in terms of you might not have started in terms of participate in a study and you said like, now I'm cheating. Maybe it's because you're put in a position where you realize from the beginning, oh well, I can actually cheat. Then you just take the opportunity and because of one of your personality traits potentially, yeah. Absolutely, I would say that you're partly right, and I think our story is partly right, because if you look at the results, I mean, it obviously shows it's not socialism or capitalism per se, so we don't find this. For that, we would have to see the results for Leipzig and Dortmund as well, and we don't see them. And so social comparison might be a good explanation for that, because this is probably the most prevalent thing in Berlin, and it's not an effect of being in Berlin per se, because then we would also see it by people living in West Berlin, or because they were also weird people in the sense that they moved from West Germany potentially to West Berlin. Think about David Bowie or something, so they could have been as different as the East Germans who moved there. But what we see is that the longer people were exposed relative to the same cohort, there is still a difference between the two. And actually, seeing the other system now apparently affects these people who were exposed longer more than people who were not exposed to the other system for a longer period of time. Yeah.
Did you actually conduct those experiments in the citizen centers? Or?
Yes, we did this in the citizen centers. So we asked for permission first with the mayor of Berlin. Then the nice thing was we actually got permission for half and half in different regions of Berlin. We asked all of them, but out of 40, I think we got then permission for 9. And they were nicely distributed by chance, which was good. Yeah. Actually, this is a good point. We did it actually for that reason, because we thought like people would be bored there and they don't know what to do, taking part in an experiment. They're quite happy to do that. But for this to dilute our results, actually what it would have to do is to affect East and West Germans differently. And what you're suggesting is that there should be a level effect because they are bored, they're taking more money, and we should have observed in citizen centers in general that people are cheating more. Actually, we have another study where we run the same or similar experiment in 5 different countries, in China, Portugal, US, Colombia, and Germany again, but in Munich. And you could see that the cheating levels were quite similar to what we found in Berlin. Also for the citizen centers, because there we did it for in the general public, for instance, in coffee shops or something like this, or also with students in the lab. We don't have them in our study, but I perfectly agree with you. I think this is going on, and if you look at the literature on redistribution or preferences for redistribution among East and West Germans, for instance, you see that the differences over time disappear. So it kind of shows that right after the unification, apparently there was still a certain notion whether redistribution is good or bad. In our setting, whether dishonesty is good or bad. And I think for different activities, these social norms change faster or slower. And I perfectly agree that it would be very interesting to find out which of these social norms actually change more quickly and others not. You could also think about entrepreneurship. Like you didn't really learn this as an entire society in East Germany, I would say. Maybe in a different way, because you had to learn about entrepreneurship more practically. But you probably didn't inherit the company of your parents or something, because it wasn't simply not possible. And so I guess there will be a lot of factors that will affect your social norms, which are also relevant for honesty, I guess. Yeah. First of all, I think that is right. I think contextualization makes a lot of sense. I think probably we have a bit contextualization in terms of that the interaction might be the context, which is not really true because it's still an abstract task. So it should be more driving in a taxi and seeing how people are cheating or not. I think that the literature in general is interesting, that we don't see much differences for decontextualized tasks, because it shows us that it's not about people's basic morality. Like when we run the study in different countries, we thought, well, for a particular reason in their culture or in their social norms, as you said, this is because they're cheating more and they have this inherent in themselves. But then we didn't find these results, and which I found still interesting, because it shows us that it's not in people's basic morality that they differ if they do an abstract task. So you need a contextualized setting, which also shows that in an abstract sense, it's again institutions that matter. Like in terms of people are not cheaters in their text filings per se. So apparently it's the institution that helps you to do it. It's the context that helps you to do it. If it were completely contextualized, then people might not cheat at all, or only on the same basic level. Which is then again interesting, because we can actually change the institutional settings to the better, although we don't perfectly know yet how to do it, I guess.